Most people think danger arrives with sirens, shouting, or a warning. The truth is, the most dangerous moments often begin in complete silence. Rain drifted down the windows of the Alder room in slow silver streams, turning the lights of downtown Manhattan into blurred ribbons of gold and white. Nestled on the 43rd floor of a private tower overlooking the Hudson River, the restaurant was a sanctuary for people who could afford privacy. No photographers waited outside. No reporters lingered in the lobby. Deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars were discussed here between courses of dry-aged steak and rare bottles of Napa Valley Cabernet. The room smelled faintly of cedar wood, polished leather, and money so old it no longer needed to prove itself. At precisely 7:12 p.m., the elevator doors opened and Ethan Holloway stepped into the restaurant. Conversations softened. Heads turned. Not because anyone intended to stare, but because some people carried a gravity that altered the atmosphere around them. Ethan was one of those people. At 58, he was the founder and CEO of Holloway Dynamics, a technology empire whose software touched nearly every major industry in America. His company's valuation exceeded $80 billion. His face appeared on magazine covers, business journals, and television interviews. Yet tonight, as he crossed the dining room in a charcoal suit tailored with almost mathematical precision, he looked less like a billionaire and more like a man carrying an invisible weight. Claire Whitmore noticed immediately. She always noticed. Standing near the service station with a silver tray balanced effortlessly against one hand, she watched him move toward his usual table in the corner. Most people saw confidence. Claire saw fatigue, the slight stiffness in his shoulders. The extra second, he paused before sitting down. The way his gaze lingered on the rain beyond the glass. Tiny details. Easy to miss. Important nonetheless. Claire had worked at the Alder room for 14 months. To her co-workers, she was quiet, reliable, and forgettable in the best possible way. She never complained. Never arrived late. Never drew attention to herself. She wore the same simple black uniform as every other server. Her blonde hair was tied neatly behind her head. Her posture was straight without being rigid. She blended into the rhythm of the restaurant so completely that many guests forgot she was standing nearby until their water glass was magically refilled. That invisibility suited her perfectly. Ethan accepted a menu he had no intention of reading. He came here twice every month and ordered nearly the same thing every visit. Yet tonight, he seemed distracted. His attention kept drifting toward the entrance. Waiting for someone, Claire thought. She approached his table with practiced calm. "Good evening, Mr. Holloway." He looked up and offered a brief nod. "Good evening, Claire." The fact that he remembered her name surprised newer employees. It no longer surprised Claire. Ethan noticed details too. "Would you care for your usual Macallan?" she asked. "Please." His answer came automatically, but his eyes had already returned to the elevator lobby across the room. Claire moved away silently. Around her, the evening continued. Crystal glasses clinked softly. A jazz piano floated through hidden speakers. Rain tapped gently against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Everything appeared normal, peaceful even. Yet as Claire set a glass of 18-year-old scotch onto Ethan's table and glanced toward the entrance once more, a strange feeling settled in the back of her mind. It was impossible to explain. Nothing was wrong. Nothing had happened. And still, for the first time all evening, she found herself paying attention to the door. The elevator chimed again at 7:24 p.m. Claire glanced up automatically, expecting another executive, another investor, another wealthy guest escaping the storm outside. Instead, a man in a navy overcoat stepped into the restaurant alone. He paused for a moment beneath the warm lights, scanning the room with calm, deliberate eyes before following the host toward a table near the center of the dining area. Nothing unusual about that. The Alder room welcomed dozens of affluent guests every evening. Yet something about him held Claire's attention for half a second longer than it should have. It was not his appearance. He looked ordinary enough. Mid-40s, clean haircut, expensive watch, polished shoes. The kind of man who disappeared easily into a Manhattan crowd. Still, Claire noticed that he never once looked at the menu handed to him. Instead, his gaze drifted briefly toward Ethan Holloway before settling on the rain outside. 2 minutes later, the elevator opened again. This time a younger man entered carrying a leather briefcase. He thanked the hostess, smiled politely, and requested a table for one. His voice was friendly, His posture relaxed. Yet after sitting down, he placed the briefcase beside his chair and never opened it. He ordered sparkling water and left it untouched. Claire carried a tray of wine glasses toward another section of the room, but her attention continued collecting details without conscious effort. Years ago, she had learned that patterns often revealed themselves long before people noticed them. Most never learned to look. At 7:31 p.m., a third man arrived. Then a fourth. Then a fifth. None acknowledged one another. None appeared connected. Each dressed differently. Each occupied a different section of the restaurant. To anyone else, they were simply strangers sharing the same upscale dining room. Claire knew better. By 7:40 p.m., every one of them had a clear line of sight toward Ethan Holloway's table. She paused near the service station and quietly studied the room. The first man sat near the elevator entrance. The second overlooked the main dining floor. The third occupied a position close to the hallway leading toward the private lounges. The fourth sat near the emergency exit. The fifth had selected a table with an unobstructed view of both Ethan and the reception area. Separately, their choices meant nothing. Together, they formed something else entirely. Claire picked up a linen napkin and folded it mechanically while her mind worked through possibilities. Business associates? Unlikely. Competitors? Perhaps. Journalists? No. Their behavior was wrong. Journalists looked curious. These men looked patient. The difference mattered. Across the room, Ethan remained focused on his drink. Every few minutes, he checked the time on his watch. Whoever he was waiting for had not arrived yet. Claire approached another table, refilled water glasses, exchanged polite smiles with guests, and continued observing. The man near the elevator adjusted his sleeve. A simple gesture. Yet a few seconds later, the man near the emergency exit checked his own watch. Then the younger man with the briefcase shifted slightly in his chair. Tiny movements. Meaningless by themselves. Connected, they felt rehearsed. The feeling from earlier returned. Stronger now. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the river. Rain continued sliding across the windows. Inside, jazz music drifted softly through the restaurant. Crystal glasses reflected warm amber light. Everything remained elegant, peaceful, perfect. And yet Claire could not ignore a growing certainty settling quietly in her thoughts. 5 strangers had entered separately. 5 strangers had chosen remarkably strategic seats. 5 strangers seemed far more interested in one guest than in their meals. She glanced toward Ethan Holloway once more. For the first time that evening, she began to wonder whether he had noticed any of it at all. Claire had learned long ago that the human eye was excellent at seeing movement and terrible at seeing patterns. Most people noticed what happened. Very few noticed what was about to happen. She carried a tray of empty glasses toward the kitchen entrance and let her gaze drift naturally across the dining room. Nothing appeared urgent. No raised voices. No confrontations. No obvious signs of trouble. Yet the more she observed, the less she liked what she saw. The man nearest the elevator had still not ordered food. 40 minutes had passed. He had touched his water glass twice and checked the room dozens of times. The younger man with the briefcase finally opened it, but only long enough to remove a single sheet of paper. He studied it for less than 10 seconds before placing it back inside. Whatever he came for, it was not business. Claire stepped into the service corridor, exchanged a quiet greeting with another server, then returned to the dining room, carrying fresh coffee for a nearby table. As she passed Ethan Holloway's corner booth, she noticed something else. Ethan was no longer watching the entrance. He was watching his phone. The expression on his face had changed. Not concern. Disappointment. Whoever he expected had either been delayed or canceled entirely. Claire continued walking without slowing. Her reflection briefly appeared in one of the darkened windows overlooking the river. Calm face. Neutral expression. Invisible. That was how she preferred it. But beneath that calm surface, pieces were beginning to lock together. She approached a table near the center of the room where a couple was celebrating an anniversary. The husband requested another bottle of wine. Claire smiled politely and promised to return with recommendations. As she turned away, she caught sight of the fourth man. He had just adjusted his chair by perhaps 6 inches. Most people would never notice. Claire did. The adjustment created a direct line of sight toward Ethan's booth that had not existed before. Coincidence was possible. Multiple coincidences were not. Back near the service station, she retrieved the wine list and paused beside a floor plan mounted on the wall. Officially, It existed for emergency procedures. Unofficially, Claire used it for something else. She mentally traced every path through the restaurant. Main entrance, elevator lobby, service corridor, private dining wing, emergency stairwell. Then she compared those routes against where the 5 men were sitting. A cold certainty settled into place. They had not chosen random seats. They had chosen coverage. Every major access point was visible from at least one position. Anyone entering or leaving Ethan's area would be observed immediately. Claire lowered the wine list and exhaled slowly. Outside, lightning flashed beyond the clouds, illuminating the river for a brief silver instant. Inside, nobody noticed. Nobody except Claire. Her attention shifted toward the man nearest the private lounge hallway. Earlier, he had seemed relaxed. Now he was studying the reflection in a decorative mirror rather than looking directly across the room. Clever, subtle, effective. It allowed him to monitor Ethan without appearing to do so. Claire felt something stirred deep in her memory. Not a memory she welcomed. Not one she revisited often. The sensation was familiar nevertheless. It was the same feeling she had experienced years ago whenever a situation looked normal on the surface while something entirely different moved beneath it. A pattern hidden beneath another pattern. A story concealed inside a larger story. She glanced toward Ethan once more. He sat alone beneath the warm glow of a pendant light, unaware that 5 separate sets of eyes continued tracking him from different corners of the room. The billionaire looked exactly as he had an hour ago. Calm, patient, completely unaware. Claire wished she shared his confidence. Because the more pieces she connected, the more certain she became of one thing. These men had not come for dinner. At 7:52 p.m., a man finally approached Ethan Holloway's table. Claire noticed him immediately because he was not one of the 5. He carried no sense of calculation, no constant awareness of the room, no hidden attention directed toward strategic positions. He simply looked like what he claimed to be, an attorney arriving late for a meeting. Ethan stood to greet him. The 2 men shook hands and sat down. For the first time all evening, the billionaire appeared genuinely relieved. Claire watched from across the dining room as she polished silverware beside the service station. The meeting had begun. Whatever concern Ethan had carried earlier seemed to ease slightly. Unfortunately, that only deepened Claire's concern. The attorney focused entirely on Ethan. The 5 men remained focused on both of them. She approached their table with fresh water. The attorney thanked her politely. Ethan barely looked up from a folder spread across the white linen tablecloth. Numbers, documents, legal language, merger paperwork, perhaps, acquisition terms. Whatever it was, it had Ethan's full attention now. Claire refilled the glasses and stepped away. As she turned, she caught a glimpse of the younger man with the briefcase. He was watching Ethan again. Not the documents. Not the attorney. Ethan himself. Claire returned to the kitchen entrance and placed her empty pitcher on a stainless steel counter. Around her, cooks moved through familiar routines. Orders were called. Plates were prepared. Dessert trays were arranged. Everything continued exactly as it should. Yet she could feel the tension building beneath the surface like pressure inside a sealed pipe. One of the line cooks smiled and asked if she was doing all right. Claire returned the smile automatically. "Just a long night," she answered. The explanation sounded reasonable. It was also untrue. Back in the dining room, another small detail caught her attention. The man near the elevator checked his phone. Seconds later, the man near the emergency exit stood and casually walked toward the restroom corridor. Nothing unusual, except that his movement created a clearer route between Ethan's booth and the hallway leading to the private lounges. Another adjustment. Another subtle improvement. Another piece fitting neatly into place. Claire felt her pulse slow rather than quicken. Stress had never sharpened her focus. Calmed it. She began tracking every movement in the room with greater precision. The 4th man ordered coffee he never drank. The 5th requested the check despite barely touching his meal. The younger man with the briefcase repositioned his chair again. Tiny changes. Tiny corrections. Each one insignificant alone. Together, they formed a pattern she could no longer dismiss. Her eyes shifted toward Ethan. He remained absorbed in conversation. Occasionally he nodded. Occasionally he signed a page or reviewed a document. Completely unaware. Claire considered her options. She disliked assumptions. Assumptions created mistakes. Facts created clarity. Yet facts were accumulating rapidly. 5 coordinated strangers. Strategic seating. Continuous observation. Constant adjustments. Nobody appeared interested in food. Nobody appeared interested in conversation. Everyone appeared interested in Ethan Holloway. Claire knew what common sense would say. Tell security. Tell management. Let someone else handle it. The problem was that there was no obvious reason to justify alarm. Nothing illegal had occurred. Nothing openly threatening had happened. 5 men sitting quietly in a restaurant was not a crime. She understood exactly how the conversation would go. Management would thank her. Security would glance around the room. The men would appear perfectly ordinary, and the opportunity to understand what was really happening would disappear. Her gaze drifted back toward Ethan's table. For a brief moment, he happened to look up. Their eyes met across the dining room. Ethan offered a polite nod, the kind a regular customer gives a familiar server. Claire returned the gesture. Then she noticed something else. On the table beside Ethan's right hand sat his phone. The screen illuminated briefly. A message had arrived. Ethan read it, and for the first time that evening, the color seemed to drain from his face. For a moment, Ethan Holloway stared at the illuminated screen without moving. The attorney across from him noticed the change immediately. His expression tightened. He leaned forward and asked a quiet question that Claire could not hear. Ethan did not answer right away. Instead, he read the message a second time, then a third. Whatever had appeared on that screen had transformed the atmosphere at the table more effectively than any spoken words could have. Claire remained near the service station, outwardly occupied with arranging dessert menus. In reality, her attention was fixed on the corner booth. Ethan finally lowered the phone. The attorney spoke again. This time, Ethan responded with a short sentence and a subtle shake of his head. Not anger, not frustration, something closer to concern. Across the dining room, movement began. The man near the elevator stood and walked toward the reception area. The timing was perfect. Too perfect. He exchanged a few casual words with the hostess before stopping beside a decorative display overlooking the lobby entrance. Moments later, the younger man with the briefcase requested his check. The man near the emergency exit returned from the corridor and resumed his seat. Everything looked ordinary. Claire knew it was not. The pieces were moving now. Slowly. Deliberately. Like chess players advancing positions before the final phase of a match. She carried a fresh pot of coffee toward a nearby table and used the opportunity to scan the room again. Every major pathway remained covered. Every strategic position remained occupied. More importantly, the men appeared increasingly aware of one another's movements without ever acknowledging each other directly. A glance, a shift in posture, a timing adjustment measured in seconds. Tiny signals invisible to almost everyone else. Claire's certainty hardened. This was coordination. At Ethan's table, the attorney suddenly checked his own phone. His reaction mirrored Ethan's. Surprise first, then concern. He spoke rapidly. Ethan listened. Neither man touched the food sitting untouched between them. Outside, rain hammered harder against the glass. Lightning flickered beyond the clouds. The city skyline shimmered beneath sheets of water. Inside, soft jazz continued playing as though nothing had changed. Claire felt the strange calm that always arrived when uncertainty finally disappeared. Earlier, she had suspected something was wrong. Now she knew. The question was no longer whether a plan existed. The question was when it would begin. She approached Ethan's table carrying a fresh glass of water. The attorney barely noticed her. Ethan seemed equally distracted. As she placed the glass beside him, her eyes briefly caught the phone still resting near his hand. The screen had gone dark, but one line from the message remained visible in the notification preview. She saw only 6 words before the display faded completely. Your meeting location has been compromised. Claire's pulse did not change. Her breathing remained steady. Yet those 6 words confirmed everything. She stepped away from the table and continued toward the kitchen. Behind her, Ethan immediately picked up the phone again. Across the restaurant, the younger man with the briefcase stood from his chair. At almost the same moment, another of the 5 adjusted his position near the reception area. No alarm sounded. No one raised their voice. Guests continued eating expensive dinners beneath warm lights and polished glass. But Claire could feel the invisible lines tightening across the room. The trap she had sensed for nearly an hour was no longer being prepared. It was beginning to close. Claire did not hurry. That was the first rule she had learned years ago. The moment people sensed urgency, they changed their behavior. The moment they changed their behavior, valuable information disappeared. She moved through the dining room at the same measured pace she had maintained all evening. To every guest around her, she remained exactly what she appeared to be, a quiet waitress carrying a tray between tables. Inside, however, her mind was moving far faster. The message on Ethan Holloway's phone had confirmed the existence of a threat. The behavior of the 5 men confirmed coordination. What remained unclear was the objective. She needed answers before events moved beyond observation. Near the reception area, the man who had spent nearly an hour pretending to admire the lobby display finally sat down again. Yet instead of facing the room, he positioned himself toward the elevator entrance. Another adjustment. Another layer added to an already intricate arrangement. Claire noticed something else as she passed nearby. A small earpiece, flesh-colored, nearly invisible beneath his right ear. She continued walking without reacting. The discovery answered one question immediately. The 5 men were communicating. Across the room, the younger man with the briefcase appeared to receive something on his phone. Seconds later, another member of the group casually stood and approached the bar. Not to order a drink, not to speak with anyone, simply to occupy a different position. The timing was too precise to ignore. Claire entered the service corridor and paused beside a storage alcove rarely used during dinner hours. There she finally allowed herself a moment to think. The restaurant possessed 3 practical exits: the main elevator lobby, the emergency stairwell, the private executive elevator accessible through the lounge wing. Every one of those routes now sat within sight of at least one member of the group. Coverage, observation, control. The realization settled heavily into place. They were not focused on entering. They were focused on preventing movement once something began. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Memories she spent years avoiding flickered through her thoughts. Conference rooms, security briefings, behavioral analysis reports, long lessons about predicting human decisions before those decisions were made. Skills she had buried beneath 14 months of carrying menus and pouring coffee. Skills she had promised herself she would never need again. Yet here they were, waiting patiently beneath the surface. She opened her eyes and returned to the dining room. Ethan's attorney was speaking more urgently now. Documents had been gathered into a neat stack. Whatever business had brought them together seemed forgotten. Ethan himself appeared increasingly troubled. Twice he looked toward the entrance, once toward the elevator. He knew something was wrong. He simply did not know where to look. Claire approached the table carrying fresh coffee. As she set the cup beside him, Ethan finally spoke. "Claire." His voice stopped her. She turned politely. "Yes, sir." He hesitated for a second. "Have you noticed anything unusual tonight?" For a brief moment, the sounds of the restaurant seemed distant. The jazz music, the conversations, the clinking glassware. Claire looked at him carefully. Then she glanced around the room. The 5 men remained in position, watching, waiting, adjusting. The trap was no longer hidden from her. The question was whether Ethan was ready to hear the truth. "Yes," Claire said quietly. "I believe I have." For several seconds, Ethan Holloway simply stared at Claire. The attorney beside him looked confused, uncertain whether to take her seriously or dismiss the comment as nervous speculation. Claire understood the reaction. She was a waitress standing beside a table occupied by men whose decisions shaped billion-dollar industries. Nothing about her appearance suggested expertise. That was precisely why people overlooked her. Ethan lowered his voice. "What exactly have you noticed?" Claire placed the coffee pot on the table and answered without hesitation. 5 men entered separately. None of them came here to eat. They positioned themselves to observe every exit route in the restaurant. At least one is wearing a concealed communication device. They are coordinating movements without speaking to each other. The attorney frowned immediately. "That is a serious accusation." "It is an observation," Claire replied calmly. Ethan continued studying her face. Unlike the attorney, he did not interrupt. He seemed to recognize something beneath her measured tone. Confidence. Not fear. Not guesswork. Confidence. Across the room, one of the 5 men stood and slowly approached the bar. Another checked his watch. A third appeared to receive a message. The timing was becoming more compressed now. Adjustments that once occurred every 15 minutes were happening every few minutes instead. Claire noticed Ethan noticing them as well. Once the pattern became visible, it was impossible to ignore. The billionaire leaned back slightly and glanced around the dining room. For the first time all evening, he was not looking as a customer. He was looking as a strategist, as a man accustomed to evaluating risk. The change was immediate. His eyes lingered on each individual Claire had identified. One near the elevator, one near the emergency exit, one near the private lounge corridor, one near the center of the room, one near the reception area. Separate pieces. One arrangement. Ethan's expression hardened. "How long have you been watching them?" he asked. "Since the second one arrived," Claire answered. The attorney let out a quiet breath. "If this is true, we should contact building security immediately." "No," Claire said. Both men looked at her. Her answer had come too quickly, too confidently. Claire glanced toward the reception area. If they are coordinating through earpieces, any obvious security response will change their behavior. We still do not know their objective. Ethan remained silent. The attorney looked increasingly uncomfortable. Yet neither man could argue with the logic. Claire continued scanning the room. Then she noticed something new. The younger man with the briefcase was no longer watching Ethan. He was watching Claire. The realization arrived instantly. Her observation of them had not gone unnoticed. For the first time that evening, someone inside the group had identified her as a variable. The briefcase remained closed beside his chair. His posture remained relaxed. Yet his attention never left her. Claire felt an old instinct awaken fully. The situation had changed. She was no longer observing from outside the pattern. She had become part of it. Across the restaurant, thunder rolled beyond the glass walls. Rain streaked down the windows in silver ribbons. The jazz music continued. Guests laughed softly over expensive dinners. Everything still appeared normal. Yet Claire knew the truth. The invisible game unfolding inside the Alder room had entered a new phase, and everyone involved was beginning to realize it. Claire held the younger man's gaze for less than a second before turning away. The worst mistake a person could make in a situation like this was revealing what they knew. Awareness was an advantage only until the other side realized you possessed it. She resumed her work exactly as before, collecting empty glasses from a nearby table and exchanging polite smiles with guests who had no idea they were sitting in the middle of something far larger than an ordinary dinner service. Across the room, Ethan Holloway watched her carefully now. The billionaire had spent his career evaluating people, investors, executives, competitors. Yet nothing about Claire fit the role she appeared to occupy. Most servers would have been nervous. Most would have contacted a manager and stepped away. Claire seemed almost unnaturally calm. The attorney noticed it too. "Who exactly is she?" he asked quietly. Ethan did not answer. He did not have one. Meanwhile, the pattern continued evolving. The man near the elevator received a message and immediately adjusted his position by several feet. The movement appeared casual. Claire recognized it as preparation. The individual near the reception area mirrored the adjustment less than 30 seconds later. Another silent signal. Another coordinated response. Then something unexpected happened. A sixth person entered the restaurant. Unlike the others, he was not trying to blend in. He wore an expensive gray coat darkened by rain and carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. The hostess greeted him immediately. Several staff members seemed to recognize him. Claire studied the newcomer as he removed his coat. Within moments, she noticed a reaction from the 5 men. Tiny, almost invisible, yet unmistakable. Every one of them tracked the newcomer's arrival. Not openly, not obviously, but they all noticed him. Claire felt another piece click into place. Perhaps Ethan Holloway had never been the only target of attention tonight. The newcomer was escorted toward a private table near the lounge corridor. As he passed Ethan's booth, the 2 men exchanged a brief nod of recognition. Business associates, Claire guessed. Perhaps friends. Whatever the connection, it mattered. The room suddenly felt smaller, more complicated, more dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with physical harm. Information, influence, reputation. Those were the currencies people like Ethan dealt in. Claire suspected that whatever plan was unfolding tonight revolved around one of them. Near the bar, the younger man with the briefcase finally opened it again. This time he removed a slim folder and placed it on the table. He never looked down at it. Instead, his eyes drifted toward the newcomer, then toward Ethan, then toward Claire. The sequence repeated twice. Observation, assessment, calculation. Claire understood enough to know that the situation had reached a critical point. The people orchestrating events were no longer waiting passively. They were measuring reactions, testing variables. deciding what happened next. Outside, the storm intensified. Rain lashed against the windows with renewed force. Lightning illuminated the Hudson River in brief flashes of silver. Inside, warm light reflected from crystal glasses and polished wood. The contrast felt surreal. Two entirely different worlds occupying the same space. Claire set down a tray and glanced toward the wall clock near the service station. 8:17 p.m. Less than an hour had passed since Ethan arrived. Yet everything inside the restaurant had changed. And deep down, Claire knew the most important revelation of the evening had not happened yet. At 8:21 p.m., the final piece revealed itself. Claire was carrying a tray of untouched dessert menus when she noticed the newcomer in the gray coat stand from his table and head toward the private lounge corridor. Instantly, the younger man with the briefcase rose as well. Not hurried, not obvious, just precise. Across the restaurant, two of the other men adjusted their positions within seconds. The pattern Claire had been tracking all evening suddenly aligned with perfect clarity. Their attention had never been centered on Ethan Holloway alone. Ethan had been the anchor point. The real objective was information, access, leverage. The newcomer was carrying something they wanted, and Ethan's presence had created the ideal environment to obtain it. Claire crossed the dining room and stopped briefly beside Ethan's table. "Do not leave your seat," she said quietly. Ethan looked up. Something in her voice convinced him immediately. "Why?" he asked. Claire glanced toward the corridor. "Because the plan is moving." Before either man could ask another question, she continued walking. The younger man with the briefcase disappeared through the lounge entrance. One of his associates shifted to block the clearest line of sight into the hallway. Another moved closer to the elevator lobby. The coordination was no longer subtle. It was active. Claire reached the corridor entrance and paused. Through the partially open doorway, she could see the newcomer speaking on a phone near a private conference room. The younger man approached him with the easy confidence of someone pretending to belong. Claire noticed something else immediately. A folder had changed hands. Not through force, not through confrontation, through confusion, through distraction, through a carefully constructed sequence of events designed to make one person hand valuable information to the wrong individual without realizing it. The entire evening had been built around that single moment. Claire stepped forward before the exchange could conclude. "Excuse me, sir," she said to the newcomer. "You left this at your table." She held up a leather check presenter she had grabbed moments earlier. The interruption lasted barely 2 seconds. Yet it was enough. The newcomer looked away from the man approaching him. He looked at the presenter, then at Claire, then at the folder in his own hand. Realization spread across his face. The younger man's smile disappeared instantly. The opportunity was gone. Within moments, the carefully arranged coordination began unraveling. The man near the elevator received a message and headed for the exit. Another settled his bill and left. A third abandoned his coffee. One by one, the pattern dissolved. No confrontation occurred. No dramatic scene unfolded. The plan simply collapsed because someone had recognized it before it could succeed. 20 minutes later, the restaurant had returned to normal. Rain still tapped against the windows. Jazz still floated through hidden speakers. Guests continued their conversations. Yet Ethan Holloway sat in silence watching Claire clear a nearby table. The newcomer had already thanked her personally. Building security had quietly reviewed footage. Questions were being asked. Answers were being found. Ethan approached her as she folded a linen napkin near the service station. "Who are you really?" he asked. Claire smiled faintly. It was the first genuine smile he had seen from her all evening. "Just a waitress," she replied. Ethan almost laughed. Neither of them believed it. A week later, he returned to the Alder room. The corner booth was waiting. The rain had returned as well, tracing familiar paths down the glass. But Claire Whitmore was gone. She had resigned 3 days earlier. No explanation, no farewell, only a small envelope left with the manager. Inside was a single handwritten note. Ethan unfolded it slowly. The message contained only one sentence. "Some storms are easiest to stop before anyone realizes they were coming." Ethan looked out across the city lights shimmering beyond the rain and sat quietly for a long time. Because for the first time in years, a billionaire understood something money could never buy. The most extraordinary people are often the ones nobody notices at all.